everyone, and welcome to this lecture on the elements of fiction, which is going to be new to some of you and review for some of you. And this is specifically in preparation for your literary analysis paper. One element in any literary analysis that is worth looking into is the idea of character. Character doesn't just mean an individual who is a part of a story. It also refers to the psychological makeup of an individual in the story. You can quite rightly refer to the character of a character. There are a couple types of characters, and they are interchangeable. For one thing, you may have a round character, and that is someone who is a fully developed and psychologically deep and believable character. You know something of their backstory, you know something of the way they think and how they act, and they are believable as human beings. On the other hand, a flat character is a character that has no psychological depth at all and is two-dimensional. Generally, they're only given a name or they stand in for something. For example, the character of Prospero in Masque of the Red Death could be said to be flat because we really don't know anything about him other than the fact that he is a prince and that he is holed up in his castle during the Red Death, and that's essentially it. It is also possible for a character to be either dynamic or static. A dynamic character is one who changes in some meaningful way in the course of a story. Either they learn something, or they develop, or something happens to them that changes their life. Whereas a static character is a character who remains the same person that he or she was at the beginning of the story. In other words, the character has really learned nothing from their experiences during the course of the story. It is possible to mix and match these, however. It is possible, for instance, to have a round character who is dynamic. In fact, that's generally the case. If you have a round character, they're going to be dynamic. But you can also have a round character who is static, somebody that is psychologically deep, but they don't actually change in the course of a story. It's not really possible to have a flat dynamic character, and it's more likely that you might have a flat static character because if they really don't have much of a backstory to them, then they're probably not going to change all that much either. You may also talk about who the protagonist of a story is. The protagonist is the character who is often referred to as the hero of the story, or to whom most of the main action of the story happens. When you have a book-length work, it is actually something that you can do to write a paper about who the actual protagonist of a book is. Because if you have multiple people to whom the story is happening, you might be able to make an argument for one character being the main character or the hero of the story over anybody else. The antagonist is the character or set of characters who create tension or conflict within the story. Sometimes a story doesn't have an antagonist. Nearly all stories do have protagonists, though. There's always going to be something to whom the action of the story is happening, but not always somebody who actually creates tension or conflict within the story. And by the way, an antagonist can sometimes be a symbolic figure, such as the figure that is wearing the Death's Head mask in Masque of the Red Death. That's the antagonist of the story, but you can also say that the antagonist of that story is death itself. If you do a character-based literary analysis essay, some of the research questions you could ask are, how does a specific character change in the course of a story? Or in a story with multiple characters, who is the protagonist or who is the antagonist and why? And why might a character make the choices that they make in the course of a plot? Because sometimes the reason for those choices could themselves be arguable. In a literary analysis essay, you can also look at the plot itself. The plot refers to the actual sequence of events in the story, or the ordering of the events in the story, and whether or not the ordering of events actually makes a change in the way you write about the paper. You can refer to the rising action, which are the events in the story leading to a complication, which is a problem or a set of problems within the story that creates conflict for the antagonist. Oh, actually, that should be creates conflict for the protagonist. My apologies. I'm glad I saw that. A crisis point is an event in the story that further complicates matters for the protagonist. The climax of the story is the point of greatest conflict within the story. For example, in Mask of the Red Death, that's the moment in which the figure in the Death's Head mask reveals itself to be literally death. Falling action are the events following that climax that lead to the resolution of the story. Some stories jump right off a cliff. They end with the climax and they don't have any falling action at all. And the denouement, which is French for resolution of the story or the ending. It's literally the unknotting of the story. If you do a plot-based literary analysis, some of the questions you may ask are, in a book with many major events, what are the big crisis points and what is the climax? You can also talk about why it's important that these crisis points or climax happen when and where they do. You can also write about what complications arise in the book that move the plot along, and whether or not the plot would still move the same way if those complications didn't happen exactly where they do or happen at all. Something else that you can address in a literary analysis paper is the idea of conflict. And you may have learned about this in high school under different names. If the phrases man versus man, man versus nature, man versus society sounded all familiar to you, then you were learning about conflict. Because not every character is male, obviously, I'm renaming these a bit. And the various different conflicts that can exist in a story or a novel would be human versus human, in which people themselves are in conflict with each other. Human versus nature, such as we see in the short stories of Jack London. The short story How to Build a Fire, for instance, is a very good example of human versus nature. But it's also human versus himself in this case, because the guy is working against his own ego. Human versus society, in which somebody is dead set against the society in which they're in. Human versus God, if we're talking about actual characters that have some sort of conflict with whatever creator that they pray to. Human versus machine or technology, which is pretty self-evident, or human versus destiny and fate. And the research question you can ask is, what are the major conflicts in a given story or novel, and how do we know? You can also, instead of just listing what the conflicts are, you can argue whether or not those conflicts are more important than other conflicts in the novel or the short story, and how they would be different, the short story or the novel, if that conflict wasn't there. Setting is another thing that you can look at in a literary analysis. Setting refers to not only the geographical location of the story, but also the time period, the social climate, everything that sets that story in one context. If you're talking only about the geographical location, though, that is referred to as the locale. The sorts of research questions you can ask here include, why might the author have chosen the settings that they chose? In other words, if you're looking at Mask of the Red Death, then why did Edgar Allan Poe, who was writing in the mid-19th century, choose to set his story much further back in time and seems to have set it in Europe rather than in America? How might the story be different if it were set elsewhere? If you were looking at a novel and seeing that it was set in America, for instance, how would that novel differ or not differ significantly if it were set someplace else? And a big potential question that you could answer with a literary analysis paper is on the idea of theme. This would be the underlying meaning or meanings of a story or a novel, because any story or novel can have more than one underlying meaning. These are fairly subjective, so they need to be validated and backed up by textual or outside evidence. For that matter, all of these things do have to be backed up with textual evidence, but in terms of theme, you may have to look at outside evidence as well. You should also be very careful of anything that smacks of what the author intended the theme to be, because what the author intended as the theme of the story or the book may not always be the only theme of the story or the book, because that story or book tends to have a life outside of what the author gave it. And you can make an argument that even though this person intended this book to be about this, it ends up being about this instead. So you can ask, what are the underlying themes of an entire work? And how do we know? What specifically in the text lets us know that this is the meaning of the book or the short story? In terms of an overall thrust for the paper or for textual evidence, you can look at rhetorical devices. These include symbolism, using words, objects, actions, or characters to stand in for something larger, like that character at the very end of Masque of the Red Death who stands in for the idea of death. You can also look at simile and metaphor. Simile is comparing two dissimilar things using a connector such as like or as, whereas a metaphor doesn't use those connectors and simply says that the thing is this. So in the famous line, "My love is like a red, red rose," it's simile. If you were to say, "My love is a red, red rose," it would be a metaphor, and that would intensify what is being said about the person in that particular work. You can also address things like mood, which is the emotional feeling that an author establishes in the story. You can talk about how the author establishes mood and why that's important to the story or the book overall. You can also refer to the tone of the work, which is the feeling that the author, him or herself, seems to have towards the characters in the story. If you can sense, for instance, that the author doesn't like a particular character or has a thing against a particular character, you can talk about the textual evidence that shows this to be the case. You can also address dramatic irony, which is what the reader can see that the characters themselves cannot. This is definitely a trope that comes up a lot in Edgar Allan Poe's short stories. I'm not going to name particular stories, but I will say that it quite often happens in a Poe short story that you have a first-person main character who is actually insane. They claim that they aren't, but there are certain things in the narrative that tell us that they definitely are. They don't actually see those things the same way that we do. And if that's the case, that is a version of dramatic irony. Some rhetorical devices may be grouped under the heading of plot, such as the ones that are listed on this slide. You can talk about flashbacks, for instance, in which a part of the narrative shows us an event or a series of events in the past that somehow impinges on the current day plot. You can do a flash forward, in which the narrative shows us an event or series of events in the future. Foreshadowing is when the narrative gives us clues about what will happen later in the story. And nonlinear narratives are those in which the plot doesn't follow a chronological order. A famous example of this is the movie Pulp Fiction, for instance. Even though this does happen in books and short stories, whenever you have a book or a short story that goes backwards and forwards in time, then you could call it a nonlinear narrative. In each of these cases, you can talk about why the presence of these devices is important to the plot and how they might change the book. You can also make an argument about whether or not the book would be any different if it were told in a completely linear fashion. So the sorts of things you can ask if you're talking about rhetorical devices are, what does a particular element symbolize throughout a work? If there is a book in the book itself, what does that book symbolize? If a poem or a play or something else is quoted often in that work, what does that symbolize? How does the author establish tone in the work? What ways does the author use to make you feel a certain way or to show you how they feel about certain characters or events? How does the author use dramatic irony? In other words, how does the author show us what characters are not seeing themselves and why are those things important to the plot? Also, if the plot is nonlinear, why is it nonlinear? And how might it be different if told chronologically? You can also address what point of view the story is told in. First-person point of view is when the narrator of the story is either an active participant in the story, sometimes even the protagonist, or simply refers to him or herself as I. First-person narration also can and does involve an unreliable narrator. That tends to be where unreliable narration happens most often because, obviously, if the person in the story is narrating it, they're the ones that are going to be unreliable because you can't, or rather they can't see exactly what it is that you see. Second-person narration is fairly rare. That's when the narrator uses you throughout the story to make the reader of the story the main character. In fact, that's part of the reason why I tell you to avoid using you in your papers unless you are specifically talking to the reader, unless you are saying, if you were in this situation, what would you do? Because sometimes using you can either make the reader uncomfortable or it can cause you to say things about the reader that aren't true, and you don't want to do that. The most common point of view in fiction is third person, and these are when the characters in the story are referred to as he or she or they. The narrator of the story is not an active participant in a third person point of view story. There are a couple different types of third person point of view, though, and you have to be careful of these. You can have an omniscient third person narrator, and that's going to be a narrator who is able to see and know all and can tell us everything and can get into the heads of multiple different characters. Or you can have a limited third person point of view in which the narrator knows and sees only what the main character the story is following knows or sees. Sometimes a book will follow one character for, say, a set of chapters. And in that case, you could say that a third-person omniscient point of view changes to limited in these particular cases. So there might be a mixture of these things. You also have objective third-person point of view, which is when the narrator makes no judgments about the characters or their situations. And you also get editorial third-person point of view, in which the narrator's judgments on a character or situation are implicit or explicit. And these terms, again, can be mixed. One can refer to a story as having a third-person limited objective point of view, or a third-person limited editorial point of view. You can also have a third-person omniscient objective point of view, or a third-person omniscient editorial point of view. Again, the sorts of things you'd be asking is, why does the author use that point of view? What effect does it have on the story or the book? If you have a book that's told from multiple points of views, for instance, how would it change if it were told from the point of view of just one person in first person point of view? Or if it's told from the viewpoint of multiple characters, how might it be different if each of the character stories is told in first person? And how would the story be different if told from another character's point of view? For example, if you were telling the story of the Mask of the Red Death from the character of Death's point of view, what would that be like? What would that even look like? In any case, whatever particular element of fiction you decide to focus on in your literary analysis, your literary analysis paper is always going to have a form of the following. It's going to have an arguable thesis or main idea. If you're simply telling somebody something that they can learn from just reading the book themselves, there's no point in doing the paper, because the entire point of doing a literary analysis is to pull the story or the book apart to figure out how its parts all work together, and those would be those elements of fiction. You need at least 2 or 3 reasons that your thesis is valid. In other words, if you think that, say, The Masque of the Red Death would be better if it were told from the point of view of Death himself, then you have to give reasons why you think that to be the case. For each of those reasons, you also have to use evidence taken from the text itself, such as direct quotes and or paraphrases. In fact, you definitely should have direct quotes from the short story or the novel in your paper. You also can include evidence from outside sources when appropriate. In some cases, these will be required, in other cases not. But if you find it useful and instructive to look at outside sources and what they have had to say about a particular book or a short story, then that is when you would bring those in to show that these validate the reasons you feel that the thesis is true or valid. And finally, for each of these points and for each bit of text, you have to give an explanation of how the text quoted proves the point that you're making. It's not enough to simply say, this character is round. Here is a passage from the book. You then have to explain why the passage from the book or the passage from the short story proves that that character is round. You have to tie each one of these points back up. You have to tie the end of each paragraph back to the point that you're making with that paragraph or to the larger argument. If you have any questions about any of this, you know how to reach me, and good luck.